to our final Dean Seminar of the year with our esteemed guest, Professor Peter Kaufman, Alum of the Year. Please help yourself to coffee and a lunch in the back if you haven't already. I'm Marshall Cunningham. I am the Associate Coordinator of the Craft of Teaching in the Study of Religion program here at the Divinity School. I just want to say welcome. A couple of quick announcements before the talk gets started. For those of you who are interested in the program, we have two important events coming up. Friday, May 6th, we have the Introducing Religion Part 2 colloquium. It's an all-day colloquium with faculty members from the Divinity School talking about how they approach teaching religious texts or materials they deem religious. It's a very fascinating thing. It's great to get so many faculty members in one room. It's all day, there's lunch, you can come for as little or as much as you want. So please put that on your calendar. Second of all, on May 24th, which is Tuesday, from 12 to 2, we have a program called Using Ethnography to Teach Religion with Professor Ali Ustar. It's going to be very, very cool. Please check out the website for more details on that because there's actually a decent amount of preparation going into it. But we are very excited to be doing this program with Professor Ustar and how to implement your own ethnography in the classroom. And finally, please check out the Craft of Teaching WordPress blog. You can find a link to the Craft of Teaching Divinity School website. This quarter, our alumni cohort will be engaging with Professor Kaufman's paper that we all read before today's program, and some of the issues brought up therein. So we're hoping to have an ongoing conversation, and feel free to comment and spread it on your Facebook walls and your Twitter feeds, and the like. So with that, in the issue of time, I'm going to turn things over to Rosie Martin to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Mr. Cunningham. We'll now pass out the quiz on Peter's article, since we've already so I'm in the odd situation here of having something come full circle in a really delightful way, and so you'll have to forgive me if I begin with a personal anecdote and take you back 29 years to the winter of 1987 when it was cold and snowy here. I heard that's impossible for you to imagine. And I had been advised by the dean of students with whom I was working that I should recruit in the southeast during the month of January. So I went down to a number of schools in North Carolina and Florida, and I went to the UNC Chapel Hill, and I'd been told by Dean Lewis that I should contact Professor Peter Kaufman, who was an alum of ours, and that he would treat me right. So I called Professor Kaufman up and said I wanted to come and recruit students, and he said, well, that's great. But I want you to come to my class. I want you to see what our students are like. And I did, and he was teaching Dante at the time. I think it was Canto 12, but I'm not sure about that. And I was in a classroom with the man we're honored today for, among other things, his superior teaching. And it was a great class. And I learned more about North Carolina Chapel Hill and its students, and especially about someone who's become a great friend and a colleague, a treasured colleague from that occasion. And the combination of graciousness and skill and expertise and naturalness that bespoke had always been inspirational to me, and it's just a great privilege to salute you, Peter, today. I don't know many people who are both great intellectual historians and people who, at a time when they're officially emeritus, have a title that includes the words leadership studies. But that's Peter Kaufman. And it signals, for me at least, the remarkable combination that we celebrate today of a deep devotion to the intellectual life, to the life of argument and evidence, to the life of close reading, to the idea that history and ideas matter, with the idea that social conscience and addressing the needs of the moment and the concerns of the moment, bringing that work to people who otherwise don't get it brought to them, and instilling in them the possibility of that and the confidence to do it, that Peter has done in his work, first at North Carolina and then at the University of Richmond. He's the author of 9 books, pretty close to 50 articles, deeply published and respected scholar. Everybody wants him to help them figure out if things are good or to do good things for them. He's the editor of the Religion Around series, which has published a number of books and will publish more in the future through Penn State. And he continues to be the vigorous and active person that he is at a time when I have to say, as I approach it, it's not as easy as it used to be. So it is really a delight to welcome you, Peter, and to thank you for accepting the invitation to come and for letting us work you as hard as we're going to work you today. But I want to ask everyone to welcome Peter Kaufman. Okay, Peter's going to talk for 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor and have a kind of seminar discussion. And the rules of Manichaeism do not apply. Those of you in the outer circle are as much participants as those in the inner circle. You know, that's a big deal. Anyway, Peter.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all. Hoping it's the lunch that brought you. When I first got the email from Aaron in Cyprus, I didn't read it carefully, and I thought for several months afterward I was going to attend the Torah of teaching. And I had no idea what I was in for. Then it became a rather formidable task when I visited the website. It was a wonderful seminar. As Rick mentioned, I teach at a school of leadership studies on a small liberal arts college campus. Just finished my last class earlier this week, and of course finally no one had done the reading. So I then scurried to find out what craft teaching, how to initiate this kind of discussion. And had forgotten that this is the University of Chicago, and perhaps some, if not many of you, have done reading. So please pardon me if I summarize. What I thought I would do is start with the article that I used this semester to open the class, because it sets the stage to what I'm trying to do, and have often lectured around on the plight of the arts and sciences, arts and humanities rather, in a world becoming incredibly professionalized in the colleges and universities. At the University of North Carolina, where I taught until 2008, they built a majestic business school for young graduates about a mile and a quarter from the main campus where the arts and humanities taught, and so we no longer see our business majors, undergraduate business majors, after their second year when they run through their gen ed requirements. But I try not to present in that paper a Jeremiah, but rather an alternative to a number of approaches to saving the humanities or saving the liberal arts. And I understand we're going to have a wonderful session with, in a few weeks, isn't it true, with Martha Nussbaum and several others who are going to do a far better job. I really do appreciate what Martha Nussbaum has done in that endeavor, and I read everything she writes on that line. Unfortunately, she writes much faster than I can read, but I'm catching up. Martha is not here. Writing trouble. What I tried to do in that piece is something that, and then I'll talk a little bit about the syllabus and then open it for your questions, concerns, or alternatives. What I tried to do in that paper is to take the fact that we ought not to separate use from truth. My Dershowitz excellent sheet. And even though he reports that arts and humanities majors do better than biology majors on MedCats, do better than social science majors on the LSATs, and do better than business majors on the GMATs, which I don't understand what that stands for. It's obviously the gateway to influence and wealth. He abandoned that choice bit of information to talk about, and I pulled just a few quotes from him. The pursuit of knowledge in the arts and humanities ought to be conducted for its own sake. The arts and humanities, and I quote, stand in contrast to the applied and vocational fields. And he talks about our business in the arts and humanities as being truth, my ellipse, not use. It's similar to the Stanley Fish piece that I cited in my paper, which is entitled Save the World on Your Own Time. It's my tack, as those of you who look at it know, it's quite different. This is the first time I've actually signed it to the students. I'll talk more about that in just a second. Ordinarily, I sign something from Mark Edmondson, in my respect. We might disagree on something. Andy Abbott, who's one of yours, he did a piece called Zen of Education in the early part of this millennium, welcoming students to the University of Chicago. As the title indicates, the Zen is something so far apart from the mundane and worldly concern. My attempt is to feature the instrumental value of the arts and humanities, and since I'm in the perch or the dungeon of leadership studies, I'm able to talk about leadership within the professions and how the arts and humanities serve that. My best way to conclude that little summary of the intent is to say that Professor El-Gendi, am I pronouncing that correctly? El-Gendi?
I always say El-Gendi, but I actually have
El-Gendi. Professor El-Gendi was trying to make a response in three very, very insightful points. I would want to endorse them and perhaps add to those who haven't yet read. He talked about inverting the argument and saying that indeed arts and humanities majors do need such things as the social sciences and business curricula teach. That is quite true, but I was speaking from the subaltern position of the arts and humanities and not necessarily the dominant position of the professional schools. But it is quite true that in the undergraduate field where many of you will be, and even in graduate studies, a trip to the business school or the law school, I always found it fun to go to law school, can indeed add to the value of liberal arts education. My interpretation of the transgressive approach, Professor El-Gendi mentions he's quite right to point out that it does not sufficiently, and so let me now assert that one must master the discourse before one undermines the discourse. One must be familiar with the discourse in whatever field, with ethics, in literature, before one defamiliarizes the interpretations. So I presuppose that and should have been explicit about that. And the final concern, valid concern, that when we're talking about using the arts and humanities to create the ideal transformative professional, the professional leader, or the leader with vision and the agility of the intellect, I don't mean to ignore what Professor El-Gendi calls the deeply destructive and dehumanizing flow. I really love that. I do think that I hope that I hope that I will today continue to emphasize the transformative, the transgressive approach to teaching the arts and humanities that will create transformative and transgressive leaders in our world, because God knows, you know, we need them given the quality, I'll later call the irascible and ugly populism that seems to dominate our present. So, my students will read that in the second class, and then for those of you who didn't syllabus know that I present a whole host of questions, and then demand that the students come for the first session. In fact, I cancel the first day of classes because I know that most of my students are just returning from their summers. They are either comfortable or on a plane or fabricating excuses as to why they couldn't come to the first day of classes. So I make it required, I cut the first day of classes and make it required that they come on the second. If they can't make it to the second day of classes, they do not belong. They're not welcome in the class, but primarily because what I want to do is to talk a little bit during that class of what we're going to do to make sure that they're ready to do it. I tell them that what I'm out for is the quality of mind and intellectual agility. I'm not going to use the consumer-producer model. I am there as a provocateur. I know full well that as they are, in fact, today, evaluating me, they are going to say, rate me very low on Professor Kaufman. Has never made clear what he wants in this class. And what I want in the class is what they give me, effectively presented, and not necessarily an interpretation that I had fed to them. That approach served me well at UNC when I was working with 400 students in classes on the history of Christian tradition. I shouldn't say working, I was entertaining my graduate assistants for working. And then we usually tell the tale, one of several that become stock. I'll just give you one, your common group. That is Professor Simon Schama. Perhaps you've heard the story. When he was confronted after the second week of classes, as a smile, of students who came up to him and said, "My parents didn't send me to Harvard to be confused." You remember his comeback?
Regarding the tuition.
Well, no, his comeback, "My parents didn't send me to Harvard to be confused." He said, "Well, they certainly ought to have." What I'm out to do with them, I use a variety of methods. I present the context that they would not know in a more of a lecture format, but then we breakout groups. The University of Richmond is a very wealthy university, second largest per capita endowment in the country, and so we can afford to put caps on the class at 16 to 18. But I will break that down further in groups of 3 or 4 modules, breakout groups, and then hover over them as they do their work, puncturing whatever conclusions they try to come to, being as transgressive as they possibly can, and annoying them terribly. But what I do tell them during that first day of class, and this is where I'll open for your questions concerning, I will tell them that I am going to be a provocateur rather than a provider. And then I tell them that this is a very difficult A and a very easy B, because I don't want to, too old to discriminate between B's and B minuses, C's and C pluses. I could have retired a while ago, and I'm just not. If you don't make your A, you just get an easy B or B minus if you can't think or write. So, of course, the question, or after all, the parents are paying a hefty tuition. So they asked me, somebody always asked me, can rely upon, so what does it take to get an A then? And I say to them, and this is an excellent segue, I say, all you need to do is make me think. Make me think. You had the first question, I hear.
I don't know that I have the first question. I have a question. Floor is open, right?
What was the idea that made you think this last semester?
Good. I had several, actually. I had several good ones. I have, if you've seen the syllabus, you know it's a pastiche of classics and then some applications, some current issues. My hope is that they will apply some of the classics to the current issues. I had a wonderful paper the last run around. I make them do short papers. It was applying insights that I thought they had lost from C. Wright Mills to the oral history of the Greensboro Woolworth boycotts and the power elite. I had no intention of drawing. One was an assignment back in January, February. The other was a recent assignment where they read William Chafee's Civilities and Civil Rights, the story of Greensboro and its long stretch from Brown v. Board to the desegregation, and eventually more than total desegregation in the 70s. And they applied it to the then business elites that were trying to make just sufficient change to avoid the kind of Selma-like conflict, the Deep South's resistance, to preserve the progressive mystique, so that it is in the interest of the elites, and then they applied it to the election. It's interest in the elites to maintain the illusion of progress or the progressive mystique while holding their own power. Something that I never thought something that I've endorsed in significant ways, but it was done very creatively and this was by freshmen. I teach freshmen and sophomores only. So they don't trust me with the other class. Thank you, Bill. Yeah.
So I want to ask about transgressive a little more. And I guess the way I want to put the question is, who decides what is and isn't transgressive? Is that the responsibility? Is that the teacher? Is it the institution? And how do you make a transgression sufficiently public to still be transgressive?
It's that too, Bruce, is a great question. I went to the University of Richmond because they had a new president sure that he was going to be able to buck the trend, swim against the tide. I'm speaking primarily of admissions of undocumented, very, very courageous and competent, extraordinarily scrappy students. But found within a year of our both being there, that kind of transgression would not sit well with his colleagues or his board, and pull back. Transgressing in that case meant in a time when immigration was either a no-touch issue, typically undocumented immigration, or, and you'll hear more about this later this afternoon from me. But that was an instance of transgression that an institution made and then found it could not.
Yeah.
Subsequent to that, I have to say that in my work with this organization, we have found individuals and institutions that even at a time when it's hotly debated, and it's not so much so in some states, North Carolina, it's a terrible situation for the undocumented. Virginia, the undocumented can attend public schools, public universities, and at in-state tuition. So we've done some good work advocacy there. Who knows what's going to happen after November? But the notion within that group, instead of taking the dominant discourses in this country of tolerant human rights, I know I'm beginning to sound like Wendy Brown here, and taking them at face value, you undermine them, you dig beneath them, and find ways in which, in this case, Joe's point was appropriate too, you uncover the agenda behind well, I don't want to say behind the mask, it's not always a mask, but in Greensboro, these were genuinely people of goodwill who were trying both to maintain local autonomy in school boards and maintain an orderly progress toward integration, but they found themselves stalled in that. To return to my syllabus, if I may, that's why I teach Coriolanus. I find that my friends, after reading The Populist, Willie Stark and All the King's Men, are shocked to find that the tribunes can so easily manipulate the people and the fears and the anger of the people. I don't know whether all this fits in leadership studies, but I know that every time I walk into a class, I'm trying to undermine the conventional wisdom may be conventional, but it's really wisdom. Is the way I would phrase it. It's an attitude, institutionally, and it's one. I was talking. Is it John? I was talking to John about one of my early, I call them success, trying in a very small class. John, you know John's work, those of you on board, excellent work, extraordinary work. Was undertaken when it was even less popular than it is now by one of my former students, who actually, flew in the face of conventional wisdom in terms of death penalty, and one of the pioneers. what is generally called in some places the Innocent Project, although that's broader. Another of my colleagues, my former students at the Motley Fool, decided to do investing in a very different way. Dennis Whittle, who's done in global giving, philanthropy, and an extraordinary work with the World Bank. Mary Small, who's doing immigration work, detention work. These are all folks who may be doing this without having taken a single or 2 or 3 classes. But I keep pushing them and prodding them. Most of them go on to do very good work within the grooves, within the convention. A few of them. That's what I mean. I know I'm trumpeting their virtues and claiming them as mine. I do the same with my incredible middle linebacker at the university. I tell all my students that he hits as hard as he does because he took my course. I'm shameless about it. Usually modest, but in this case, hell. I know that. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
I was going to ask, continuing on the topic of transgressive teaching, and you use words like annoying your students, or at one point in the paper, I think you used the word being rude to them. And I'm wondering if you get pushback from the students, and if there's any kind of balancing work you have to do in keeping them secure enough to keep talking, to keep them from just shutting down entirely, and how you walk that line, or if there is even any line to walk there.
That too is a great question. I do it with mixed success. I find that the easiest way to do that, I was listening to NPR the other day, and they had a physicist, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist from Stanford, somebody may have heard of this, who was talking about this incredibly new discovery that he had worked on. Did you hear it? On teaching that the lecture format is not as effective as we often think it is. Did you see the hand? Your head? I know. It was a wonderful piece up to a point, and it was Stanford actually, and their climate prevents them from being really wise. But sorry about that. I'm from Chicago. And he spoke of it as a new discovery, these breakout modules that he used. That really is very effective in getting students to stake a position. You're quite right, freshmen and sophomores at UNC, but also the University of Richmond. They're very, it's an affluent school, it's more socioeconomically, racially and ethnically diverse, but still getting them to feel that they can push back, as you say, and having those modules from really just at least one a week and often 2 in the class that meets twice. But they break for 15 to 20 minutes and there are only 3 of them. And their faculty member comes by and says to, Rick, what are you going to let Marshall sit with that position? Are you going to, did you read the text? And then I'll leave, because if I stay there, they won't say anything. But then I'll leave. And then once they stake the position in the module, not all by any means, but a good 30 or 40% on a good day, and even more by the end of the class, we'll push back. And that's something that I was able to do. One reason I moved to a liberal arts school. But I know that that's not always, that I could not have done that in doing the history of Christian traditions, because I had to get from the New Testament from I don't know, Marcion to Margaret Thatcher in one semester, and that wasn't going to sell there. But when we would meet with the TAs, we would give them something, try to get them. Monday, Wednesday, they'd have to listen to me, but on Friday, the TAs were, and this was served well because in our graduate program, I didn't have more than 1 or 2 graduate students at any time doing medieval and early modern studies. So I would have students who, were doing South Asia and knew every Farsi and Urdu and whatever, but didn't know the difference between the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. And so it was easier for them to start a debate than actually talk. So that worked fairly well in big extent. Yeah.
I'm curious, over the course of your decade of teaching, what change you've seen in the incoming students? We hear a lot of talk about that, mostly negative, actually. And so I'm curious how you've experienced that and how that has shaped your craft of teaching.
Well, thank you for letting me boast that next year will be my 50th year in teaching. I started at Central YMCA Community College when I was still over at CTS, so that gives me. Back to the question. I wanted to get that in somewhere. So it's about damn time to have you back here. They're not as literate as they used to be. It's not that, when I bring up something about the Korean War or the Vietnamese War or, the campaign, getting them back into the 1950s, sure. We need to talk about C. Wright Mills and set the context. They don't read. They like to watch films, so I've nodded to that. One thing hasn't changed. Not 50 years ago, but when I went to UNC, it was 1976 or so, I would walk around as they dropped off the freshmen in station wagons. Some of them with those wooden, you remember, some of you remember those wooden sidings. And I would go around, I loved that day. I just loved that day because I would walk around and I think, the parents are unloading them. They don't know what I'm going to give them back. They just don't know what I'm going to give them back, what I'm going to do to their young. I do the same thing now at the University of Richmond. The only thing that's changed is they come in those huge SUVs now, packed full to the gills. They're still very impressionable. I just wish they were a little more literate. There's a lot more remedial work that you do. Forgetting that my first class, when I had the joy of just having 16 students, I had them when I taught my graduate seminary. And I walked in there assuming them that they would know what a bishop was and a pope was. Not to be the relationship between the two. So it's, I don't know, I don't think you have that problem here at the University of Chicago or in the undergraduates. I hope you don't. At the finest schools, at least let me cherish the illusion. But we do a lot, and the thing I did learn at UNC is you need to change pace. A lot of my colleagues do it with overheads, and I'm a technophobe, so I don't do that. Or little film clips in class. I can't do that. But I admire them for doing that. Still, the breakup of the class is something I do with these modules, and I keep it so that there's no an hour and a half, we get an hour and 20 minutes. Another way of saying that is that I was blissfully ignorant of how illiterate my students were at UNC, because there were so many of them in front of me. Didn't have much contact with them. And as I've often said, when my friends at UNC are puzzled about the move to a liberal arts college, I said there are two things that need to be said. The really good thing is you really get to know your students. And the downside of that is you really get to know. Please.
Peter, I hope you'll forgive me if I haven't read your piece.
No.
B minus.
I wonder whether you associate this capacity for sort of creating a transgressive environment with a general culture of privilege there at Richmond? I mean, as you know, I teach a minority-serving institution. We're majority-held, majority first-generation, majority non-English speaking background. The task of the arts and humanities where I work is really to draw students into a culture from which they've traditionally felt they've been excluded. And so there's no room for being transgressive because they don't have a base within the tradition from which to transgress.
No, it's a great point. I started, as I mentioned, at Central YMCA Community College on West Wacker, and I tried to draw the message. You hear with one of the greatest symphonies in the world, and two of the worst baseball teams in the world. Why do you pay so much to go see the Sox? Well, at that time, the Sox and the Cubs, and I do too.
They're still there.
And so do. I mean, it is the Cubs, and it is Wrigley, and have never crossed any wall. So I see that that's very, very different. But it's also probably a little easier to take the discourse and unmask it for those folks who have been. I find that when I teach history of immigration to my high school students, that it's easier to work with them. They're much more willing to give up the nostrums and the conventional wisdom and to explore alternative ways. So I think you're right. First, getting them into the humanities courses. And that's also true with many of the first-gen folks. You know, they want a job at the end, so we don't have a pharmacy program, but some of the schools I work with have pharmacy programs and nursing programs, and some of my really gifted students, not only because of parental pressure, but because they see the handwriting on the wall, they will redirect from what they enjoyed as a great history course or religious studies course into the pharmacy major. And as I mentioned in my class, I get many of those who 30 years ago, even without coming out of the under-resourced classes, felt themselves, want to come back to the extension division courses and get the history of art or get, Elizabethan literature or something. And it's a lot of fun to teach them.
Mr. Kaufman, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
In your introduction, it says you reinvented yourself.
Yes, sir.
Was that a professional reinvention or a personal one? And how do those two work together? Explain what reinvention of self means.
Okay. Okay. I mean, the question is coming from, as you know, Dean Riefeld has worn many coats and hats themselves, so a masterful reinventor. In this case, I went into something. Well, let me put it another way. Pachi, my decano friend here. One way to reinvent is to move from the classroom gradually, perhaps grudgingly, and then very effectively into administration. That is the kind of reinvention that some folks do. My reinvention was to move from teaching the history of the Christian traditions and working with graduate students to teach teachers who've gone on to teach the history of the Christian traditions and do dissertations on Gregory I and George Gifford of Elizabethan fame, not Frank. And enjoyed that immensely. What I call from time to time hibernation, because it was away from the give and take and the frustrations of what I started to do here in Chicago. My first step in Chicago was at the convention, the convention. 1968 convention. So I was politically active in civil rights and anti-war movement. Then I loved history, hibernated in history, and then was thrown into something called a leadership school, which they don't understand what it is. I'm the humanities person, now that Doug Hicks has left, the only humanities person among 15 social scientists. And so I had to find something to lead. I had to run through literature on leadership and knew that I couldn't add to that kind of leadership. That wasn't the organizational management approach. But I started really enjoying listening to NPR and reading the New York Times and coming out of the past, using the past now to work on the present. And of course, with my application, which is really but it was a very, very, it was a sheltered existence at UNC in so many ways that I enjoyed, and that I would applaud those of you who are heading in that direction. It's a great thing to have effects on your students, to a world in which I have to raise money. And I guess the one thing to be said is I get paid a lot more talking about the humanities, leadership, and professions. I don't even know how much I'm getting here. I get a lot more from weird sources. I mean, I've spoken to the Energy Commission in Wyoming and business schools. Then I do going around Pache Bernie talking about investing, which I'll do this afternoon. So it's a completely different world and different people. I hope I'm still welcome in corners such as this, but this is not my usual audience.
I guess quick man, my question is, knowing you for how long have you known each other?
Now I'm going to tell the story then.
No, don't.
Now I'm going to tell the story.
I'm interested in whether the vocation of teaching is itself reinvention, whether the good teacher is the reinventor.
Yeah, the good teacher is. I mean, I walked into an office some time ago, and I'm happy to say this is a colleague at Duke, and we were talking, and this particular colleague was about ready to go to class, and opened up file door and took these yellow crinkly pages of an outline that the colleague had probably taught multiple times before. There's no reinvention there, it seems to me. But to give you an idea, you're right, you're quite right. My 101 class that I teach 4 times through 2 sections each semester, the easiest teaching level I've ever had. But I will tinker with it and throw it in. And the syllabus you saw contains about 40% new stuff. If you've seen it. So yes, a good teacher reinvents, rediscovers. But now may I tell a story? So yes, Larry and I go way back. I came here, I think it was in 71. My first year was a real tough one. I came with what I thought were adequate languages. My faculty colleagues told me I needed a few more. I was teaching full-time at the Central Lyme State Community College, and the woman I was in love with whom I just had coffee this morning, left me. And I went into the Dean of Students, Larry Greenfield, and I said, I'm miserable. It's my first term. I made a mistake. I should have gone to law school. Dean Greenfield's response was, you will look back upon this years from now and think, it was a pleasure to suffer at the university. And I have to tell you, the son of a bitch was right. You asked for it. Please.
Thank you for your presentation, and the readings were great. I have a question about the preparation of teachers and scholars and its impact on the phenomenon that you're describing. There was once, or at least in some circles, a sense that the PhD and the preparation for a career in research and teaching equalized the academy in the sense that no matter what discipline you may have been studying or teaching in, that there was a common foundation in humanities and literature and philosophical discourse, so that whether you're teaching in economics or you're teaching in religion, that there's at least a common space for conversation among the disciplines. Do you see that changing in the academy with the increase of, people adding to faculties who are coming from, kind of practical backgrounds or, out of experience, and how might the training of scholars and teachers help kind of reclaim some of what you're trying to do in your work?
Years ago, I predicted that the training of PhDs would change, that along the lines that I saw some folks experimenting, instead of a long, publishable soon doctoral dissertation, 2, 3, or 4 fine published articles on related but not identical themes, that would be the route to PhD, and people would then be well prepared to move into their teaching loads. For many of our colleagues, certainly it was for me, you've just finished work on such a narrow topic and are ready to delve into a seminar on that, and you're asked to teach an introduction to the world's religions, or the history of Christianity from here till then. And you're, for your first few years, even with the tenure pressure of publishing that huge dissertation, you're not really teaching it. You're just 1 week ahead of your class if you're lucky. It just didn't make much sense that there was that disjunction. And on the other hand, and I said to myself when I left here, I did not write a very good dissertation. I said to myself, I'm never going to publish a book. I'm just going to get to a small liberal arts college where I just don't have to publish. God damn it, I'll never go through this again. And but then I started to miss it. I started to miss the continuity of taking on a long-term project. Do I think that the professors of practice, as they're often called when they're brought in from the outside, will take over the place? I think before that happens, probably adjuncts will take over the place in most schools. And that's sad, and that's tragic. So instead of, in my career, I banged around in 3 places before I got the 4th, which was a tenure job. And the first one was when, again, another Dean Greenfield story, he called me. I didn't have a job after I got my PhD. He said, I just got a job from the Liberal Arts Environmental College in Lincoln, Wisconsin. And he said, what do you know about environmental studies? I said, I know how to spell it. But that was, if there were a way of building in that kind of versatility, we tried to do that at UNC, where individuals who were teaching in religious studies or in history would teach TA in their special area of concern, but they were also required to teach in 2 or 3 other areas. We had 5 tracks. We were really built our PhD program on the USC model, and then of course the USC model changed. But the notion was to give those folks the kind of versatility and resourcefulness that in some programs just don't have. Harvard's notorious; they just don't have it. You see candidates come from Harvard. What you're looking for is a quality of mind, and what you get is an acculturated mind, a cultural storehouse. Everything that's been written on X. That's not going to serve folks well. I don't know how things are here at USC. When I came through, this is nostalgia, we needed 2 contextual fields. I had J.Z. Smith and Frank Reynolds on one hand, and Jim Gustafson on the other. And was all the better for it, but I was kicking and screaming. All I wanted to do was do the Reformation. But my teaching was better for it, and I'm hopeful that there are ways and mechanisms in graduate programs that can be that versatile. I've been all over the map on that question. And your name, I'm sorry.
Ernest.
Ernest, I don't think Ernest ever answered it, so come back at me.
Well, to your last point, do you think interdisciplinary training at the doctoral level beyond one's kind of broader field is hopeful, and do you see any trends emerging in there? So, for example, one doing a PhD study in religion, but also engaging in philosophy or even in business, and how that might look.
Yeah, if you can do that, or even take gap years and bring that experience. It used to be, when I came through, and this will put me in the Middle Ages, very few people did PhD in religion without doing an MDiv. And I did my, another funny story, I did my BD, MDiv, DREL, DMin at CTS. And I got, I got really decent training in New Testament, as much as you could without doing Greek. Bernie made sure that cavity was filled. But it's not, an Old Testament, and I got a sense of the fields in my 3 years there. The funny thing is, I graduated, I left early to study abroad in Germany. And so they gave me my DD hood. That was the year in which, following law schools, they decided they would, if the law schools went from an LLB or LLB to JD. So in the middle of the year that I was abroad, they raised it to a doctor of ministry, a DMin. And so on and they sent me my DMin certificate. I had a BD and a DMin. I was ready for Scrabble, actually. BD and I had a DMin, and then the American Association, correct me, Theological Schools.
The Association of Theological Schools.
ATS is continuing to the doctorate with a 3-year such and such, so they changed it to an MDiv. And so I had the commencement program that gave me an MDiv. So
Stand still and you become a trek.
yeah, but that was a glorious year for people collecting letters. But the 3 years in seminary, was a kind of an interdisciplinary. Because we had social ethicists who demanded to get out in the community and do clinical work. We had sociologists of religion, and then I could come and do my concentration. But then the contextual field, you went through with contextual fields, didn't you? Yeah. That really required you not just to sit and talk with Jim Gustafson, but to take, and Jim would tell you it was a complete failure, because we did Barton Aquinas, and I kept wanting to do the historical context, and he wanted to do the application, but it was a great experience.
I was struck by something in your article. You talked about the difference between networking and befriending of students, and when I read it, I thought that's very different from the relationship that you're trying to draw between humanities and your professional schools. But then I was thinking, it makes sense when you're talking about leadership studies. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you kind of work on that interpersonal skill in your curriculum, in your classroom.
That's great. It really was not my distinction. It came from the colleagues when I did this. This was commissioned by one business school, and I moved it around to several others. And it came out of the place I least expected, which was the HBS, Harvard Business School. So two colleagues said what their students seemed, that they did not seem to collaborate well. And when you're thinking about, the teamwork that they enter into, at least that was my image of business, but they don't form friendships. And thinking back to, a little more nostalgia here, thinking back to the times we were here at, University Chicago Swift Hall. I mean, I love it here, as you can tell. And you brought my maroon sweatshirt. we built friendships across. We all experienced JZS, and that was a bomb. Jonathan C. Smith. We would go to each other's what do we call them? Brown bag lunches. So, the church historians would go to the historians of religion, even though we didn't understand what they were talking about. But it was just fun to be in the room. The same thing is true with the theologians, and it goes on and on. The friendships were built across disciplines, and there it seemed that it seemed to my colleagues that networking was getting in the way. And how do you build the interpersonal skills, the modules? My exams, they are encouraged to collaborate. It's harder to do a 750-word response or a 1,000-word response to a question with 3. Much easier to do it with 1, sitting alone at the desk. But they get punished for doing it alone. They're allowed to do it for 1. But if they're doing it for 1, then I encourage, I shouldn't say punish. I'm available for those who are doing it for 3 to orchestrate, to watch them orchestrate. And is that coming at it? It's not coming at it clearly. The distinction, though, isn't mine. I was surprised to learn it. You always get that sense of things being cutthroat in the professional schools where they hide the required text or something. But it was never like that for me, either at UNC in the graduate program or here. And it seems that arts and humanities, because the interpretations aren't fixed and because everyone's input should be valued, trying to build that trust in the community. Obviously when an idiotic opinion comes across the board, you feed it back to them as it's something really very interesting and idiosyncratic. Shall we explore it? I have the sense from the paper chase, the film Paper Chase, a little before your time, but that's not the way they do it mostly. Humiliation is part of the game. I don't know whether that's the case. Any of you been to that it is or it isn't?
No, not to law schools.
Please.
First, thanks for teaching at my alma mater, University of Richmond. It's where I met my advisor later, Marty, when he was lecturing there. And we've had a bunch of Richmond folks, John Overton and myself, Rob Moore, and some friends. We thought your colleague Doug Hicks was going to be the next president, but my first question is, if the new president, Ryan Crutcher, gave you keys to the $3 billion, what would you do to drive it more towards your ideal of education? And then just a quick follow-up question.
They won't.
There's no doubt the hedge fund managers who moved Ed Ayers to different places won't, but what if they were to?
Well, I'm not too sure. Seeing you along, I was instrumental in getting Ed to move on early. I was very pleased to see that happen.
He's had some friends on the board who also wanted that to happen.
He said
He had some friends on the board who also wanted that to happen.
Yes, and they became our friends. I think we are really alive and well that you are. I really do. We want for nothing. It's not. We have to get a surprisingly good caliber of student. I'm amazed, really. Ed, to give the devil his due, did a good deal in terms of diversifying the student body. I'm not answering your question because I'm really having trouble what I would do with if he said $3 million. If he said $3 million to me, I know where I'd build it.
Billion.
$3 billion.
That's the endowment.
Oh, 2.2. Oh, so if he said wow.
Has the dog caught the car? I'm just curious.
Wow. Yeah, well, now it makes it a lot easier. $3 billion. I would probably, we have the one glaring problem I find, well, one of the several glaring problems I find in undergraduate education is the study abroad here. where we send them to places, for the most part, which are summer camp, very easy kinds of flex courses. If I were given $3 billion, I'd build satellite campuses in really interesting places that would educate them there and not necessarily give them the kind of focus courses in many instances. And I don't mean overgeneralize, but these are programs that are ill-conceived from the get-go. Did that help? Oh, you had a follow-up. Go ahead.
That's it. Quick.
Catch me again.
Curious about your thoughts on kind of college students and kind of moral value systems they're encountering, given the context of trigger warnings, context of Black Lives Matter, context of everything from Alan Bloom to now David Brooks. David Brooks saying, I go to campus and I don't feel they're encountering deep meaning and vocational reflective. And that's probably, I guess, for at least Brooks and other folks, because there's a thin pre-professionalism or a thin moral relativism. What's your take on what they're encountering? Obviously, some people put too much emphasis. You know, that's not 18 to 22 is not where you develop that system. That was systems developed long before then. But what do you find they're encountering? Can they have deep, meaningful vocational reflection? Is that a place? Should that be happening in a university?
Yeah, no, I love David Brooks, by the way, but I think he's wrong here. The problem is on the intake. I'm afraid, and he calls them empirical kids.
He does.
And that's it. That's basically it. Mark Edmondson is good about this too. If you haven't read him, he's UVA, and notwithstanding that, he does write incredibly well about the problems faced in the arts and humanities. But they both have this skepticism of the innovation. One innovation I commend and mentioned several times, the so-called breakout groups. The sense of being in the presence of genius at Edmondson or greatness at Brooks that he had here is wonderful. And I experienced it and wouldn't trade it for the world. But in places, in many, many places, and even in those places where your younger faculty colleagues are chasing tenure and then chasing promotion, where certainly my experience at UNC, when getting the excellent professors to teach in the scholarship program I coordinated, when I started it 25 years ago, 4 out of 5 people I asked, really wonderful teachers would do it. Now, when the resources weren't there, 1 out of 5 would do it. Because now the premium was on getting good graduate students, placing good graduate students, getting grants, and of course always publishing. And I recommend getting to a place there and then moving to a smaller liberal arts college is much easier that way. It was easier for me. To your point, I think they put too much of a premium on being in the presence of and not on the kind of goading that they get from their peers, quality institutions. I think the answer isn't to decenter the classroom. I think it's to mix those experiences. We still have, and the University of Richmond was blessed with, as you mentioned, this grand endowment. We bring great people to campus. The undergraduates just don't go. The faculty members flock to it, and the undergraduates, they need to have it in their required courses to go to be in the presence. They don't respect that, but they will grow to respect it. So it's too early for that. They here at USC, I really came to respect that in ways that I could never have done in my school. I think students and undergraduates the same. So at the end of my long-winded answer, it's too young for them to have it at Princeton or appreciate it. They can have it. But to walk into the, and that's what they go to Harvard, Yale, maybe even UC. In my day, they wouldn't allow graduate students to teach and now I see them unionizing, so that must have changed, right? It's a great logo, by the way, for whoever designed it. It took me a second at the urinal to figure out with all those little fish that were going after the big fish, that was going after the little fish. A wonderful sense of both power and persecution at the same time. So if you haven't seen it, if you haven't been here for the advertisement for the union meeting, it's a fabulous. I'm sorry, I'm way off topic.
It's great. I went to those lectures for the free food. Skip Gates, fun, free food. Dick Rorty, fun. Edward Said. It's all cheese and crackers for starving Richmond students.
Oh, yeah,
Great
and the food is great. isn't it?
Thanks.
Yes, please.
I was interested and really appreciated that you were talking about transgressive teaching, the 4 elements, the Re's: recoil, reorientation, reenchantment, and resilience. In my 20 years in a significantly smaller school and smaller classrooms, I experienced that as a two-way street and wondered about your reflection on that. That, yes, I mean, by the end of the first class, my students were recoiling because I did see myself as a provocateur, I suppose. But I would do the same thing because they didn't learn the way I learned. And so every year, if I had taught the way I was taught, I never would have communicated anything to anyone. And it was this constant reinvention. So we were having a mutual recoiling, then reorienting ourselves, re-enchanting with the material and the delivery vehicles, and hopefully all of us learning resilience. And for me, especially in the last 10 years of my teaching, it was having to grow. I had no choice but to grow from technophobe to at least not being terrified of it. I'll never be a geek, but so just reflection on whether or not you also experience that as a two-way street with those 4 elements.
Yeah.
I mean, it's transgressive teaching both ways.
No, I agree. I give a midterm consumer report that where the students get to, and I get to change the way I'm doing things midstream in every class. I'll often, I repeat certain texts because I'll be repeating Edith Wharton. The first time I ever used her Age of Innocence, she read a little bit about the House of Mirth, where I taught Age of Innocence. And I became enchanted by her, by the students' responses. Now, in terms of the recoil, yeah, I recoil when I read my end of the year, but that's after they receive their grades or know where their grades are coming. And I often have to, that's where my resilience comes in. I have to return the next semester knowing full well that a good third of the classes that's used to getting A's going to be settled for grades that are far less than, you always get that, but I worked so hard, I put so much into this class, and it's not so much for how much you put in, I say, is what comes out. And they just, so you have to, I go through that, perhaps I've never put those terms to it. Yes, I affirm that. I love teaching a small little college, I'm not unhappy about that. Where is teaching?
Well, I'm not now. I'm enjoying retirement. And the recoiling for me always occurred early, and I don't mean, it's not repugnance, but it was realizing that if I keep going the way I'm going, no one's going to learn anything, not even me. And having to accommodate every semester, which was both exciting and thrilling and kept me at it. And I just saw this as being a two-way street, not just professor to class members, but class members back.
I was advised by another U of C alum, Giles Gunn, and he gave me a lot of good advice and a lot of bad advice. But the good advice was teach to the top tier.
Yes.
Teach to the top tier. Let the rest of them climb. So I recoil when the top tier pushes back in a difficult way. But I don't recoil, or I don't revise when a New Yorker student tells me that, why do I have to read the whole novel? It's tough. I have the students read over the vacation, which is something that So the students who are now registered, even the freshmen who are coming new to the class, registered in my class in the autumn, will be reading all the King's Men, instead of 600, 700 pages now, in order to get into the class. That was, and they will come. That's not the group that's going to cause me to step back. But I agree, I think that's the same. Teach to the top tier. Please.
This is a fairly simple question. Have any tips on how to help students read? Try to be a little more explicit. I've had students read in a course on slavery, something by William Wilberforce on the one hand, James Stable on the other. Trying to put these together, and I put one paragraph on the. They didn't get my job, but to put one paragraph on the board, the overhead, spent the whole class 15 minutes on just this one paragraph. I thought it was just packed. But it's a challenge. I just wanted to have good techniques.
I try two things. I don't know whether I done them as good techniques. They're working for me now, one at each level. At the college level, what I do is, in my syllabus, beneath each assignment, I throw questions at them in bold font. And what they have to do, I'll just give you short ones. They're reading, in this case, George Bernard Shaw's preface and the play St. Joan. And so in bold font, I tell them, in what ways did Joan shock those whom Shaw describes as conventional people? Would you call Joan charismatic? Why? Why not? At the start of the fifth scene, Joan seems to shun celebrity, etc., etc. So I'll go on, and I'll pump them with questions, and they know that one or two of them, I will cold call them and have them start a discussion of it. So there will be, in a way that runs counter to what I said before, that I want to be the provocateur and not pose questions, but the only way to get them to read critically is that. Now, I also teach a high school class, and these are not English-speaking, native English speakers. And there I really do that. For the first few classes, we read sometimes just 3 sentences together, 3 to 5 sentences. And it's not because of their fluency in English, because they're not sure to watch for what connects one sentence to another. Unfortunately, if I did that to my college students, some of whom really do need that, that would be the kind of condescension that probably would empty my classroom. So I don't know how to get them to read except to prime the pump with charismatic. What makes it charismatic? And then we can walk around that. Is it charisma in the reception, or is it in the divine voices, or is it in the sheer chutzpah that she has? Is it the nerve that she has? It's a question that they can't answer definitively, but having them ask it may bring them to the text readier to read. It's a device, but this, as I said to the answer to another question, I miss the literate students of the 1970s and 80s. I really do.
There are diverse challenges here as students with English as second language. But I just find a lack of general vocabulary just an ongoing challenge.
This is a case in point. I gave my exam, this is me presuming. And before I leave the room, I say, now, do you have any questions? I have one hand raised, says, could you be more explicit? What does corroborate mean? Then another, I was talking about Judge Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion in the Seattle case. What do you mean by concurring? And then, and here is the greatest crime for me, I assigned an article, the subtitle of which was The Politics of Fatalism, and the question had, why did Woody Brown title this Politics of Fatalism? And the student said, could you define fatalism for me? That was in the title of a goddamn assignment. Truly. So while you're teaching to the top tier, the bottom tier seems to bubble, percolate up. And every once in a while. And then I want, but you're right. You're quite right. Their word choice on essays become, and you have to circle and say this misleads, and they come back and say lies. talk about grammar and syntax for some, and we're talking about a very elite small little arts college. And so I feel your pain. I just did feel your pain. You're defying fatalism. Does it have something to do with fatality? Yeah. I miss literacy.
Could I try one more? It's striking how kind of requirements you have, or lateness to class. Can you switch that and talk a little bit about what are the self-requirements of the teacher going into a class? What do you do in terms of requirement that you impose on yourself?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to sound awfully virtuous, but I have to allow that, first of all, I have a very easy teaching load. Some of you will start out with 4-4, some of my friends have 4-4. I have a very easy teaching load. I have 2 sections of the same course. I very light committee duties. Nobody trusts me to put me on a big committee. And so I prepare. I reread not only the assignment, but because I want to be enthusiastic about it, I'll read something new. I go on JSTOR and I find out what's been written lately on Coriolanus. And even if it's, I may not be teaching it, but I just want to see somebody else's view. I read in the summer so that in the autumn I'm plugging. Seawright Bills didn't work too well, so I'm plugging in Clarence Darrow, Chicago, and now I'm reading Darrow's works and I'm reading Clarence Darrow. So I have the time and I have the luxury of being more diligent than, and I'm not talking about. So that's what I do, and I can put that on myself. Sometimes it doesn't work too well because, I'll be at cross purposes. I know that I said something really intelligent about the text the last time I taught it, and it won't fit anymore. Or I'll have a really good joke that I told last semester, but now I can't fit it in, and yet I squeeze it in. Sometimes the conduct of the course is a rougher for it, but I'm better prepared than my students.
I wonder if I could follow it in another way. And ask you to talk a little bit about the parts of teaching that are not circumscribed by the classroom. You referred earlier to students you're proud of who subsequently did kinds of work that you charmingly and hilarious, said I take credit for it shamelessly, et cetera. But it seems to me you could put it that way, but you could also infer that what you were suggesting is that to think that the job of teaching is done when the class is done is the story. And it strikes me looking at your CV and all that's hardly the way you think about it. I'd love to hear you talk about how you think about teaching beyond the classroom.
The first thing that comes to mind, you need to understand that Jefferson is a school to which undergraduates apply. So after they're in the second semester, the October of their sophomore year, they apply. We take a certain number into the school's majors or second. The reason that's relevant is that I'm basically the base. That's what I do. I teach freshmen, mostly freshmen, leadership in the humanities, and my job is to excite them about the curriculum. And I am excited about the curriculum. I teach with some wonderful people. Social scientists go in the beat. And so I teach to the top tier, and I invite the top tier to coffee. Now, we all have, we'll have them over for dinner as a collective, but I go one-on-one with students, not only because I want them to continue and to see them move through the school, but I also think that the trust, going back to the modules and the trust you build up, to the ability to be rude requires a degree not of exerting authority, but trust. And although I don't get to, remember, I'm only teaching 16 youngsters. 16 times 2 is 32. Actually, I don't, well, they drop, so I'm usually teaching about 28 youngsters. So I have time to meet with them outside of class. I do what's called, I call a library prowl. So there's a part of the library, if they're studying for the course, they know that they will see me once a week, Tuesday from 6 to 9. They keep odd hours, but you know, if they have any problems with the course, if they just want to talk to me, great coffee shop there. So I'm also a person, and I don't have a family of my own, so you know, this is also, but some semblance of this is something I recommend for people. You can't do that if you're doing a family and you have other major community responsibilities and you're teaching a 4-4. And but I think the one-on-one is what's valuable, and I go all the way back to Clive. Clive and I, the fellow that John and I both know. I visited him in the UK. He stayed at my place. Mary is my executive, my will, my former student. They're just, you develop those relations outside that enable the teaching to take place, not that we sit over coffee and talk about Machiavelli. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we talk about basketball. See that?
That's great. Yeah, thank you.
We are at the end of it.
Oh, well.
So I've been very lucky in my career. I've been very lucky today. Thank you for coming. I have the charm life, and thank you, Larry. You're right. It continues to be a pleasure to.